Nice. Reminded me of
I'm going.
like Illinois. Yeah.
Did you make it to British Columbia? Sorry, I just went live because it's time to go live. Did you make it to BC by any chance?
No, I did not.
Oh, well, that is the most beautiful part. That would, and of course, it's the part I happen to be from.
No bias.
Well, honestly, it is. It's the most mountainous. The Rockies is really the picturesque kind of vision of Canada you have. I mean, you can get all that in the east as well, but it's not quite as dramatic. Let's say romantic. Certainly, Western Alberta and British Columbia, I think, is the most picturesque. And if you went west, and you came through the prairies, you would have seen some of that for sure. I can't say where you were. But hello, it's live, yes. And I'm here with the Brett Stevens, a man from the past. And I was just talking to him about how he was dare I say, a golden age sort of alt-right figure, let's say, back before things became so confused and bifurcated. And a friend of mine said, you should talk to this guy recently. And I was like, him? Yeah, I remember him. He was great. He greatly influenced me. And I haven't seen him for years. And I was just saying, and he told me, yeah, he's been kicked off all social media. And that's why I haven't heard for years. Kicked off all of it. And I want to ask him about that and all the whys and wherefores of getting kicked off every single platform, I guess. But he's still out there. He's still doing his America.org and his Death Metal Underground, which is like a lot of more people I know him for these days. But I mean, this is the Brett Stevens. I'll let him maybe tell you his story. But he is a classic character. Yes, I was greatly influenced by you and America.org back when I was first becoming Red Pilled, whatever it was, over 10 years ago now.
So well, thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
Well, the honor's all mine.
Well, let's see. The alt-right sort of started back in the 2000s when people were getting kind of angsty about the way the Bush administration was going. And we sort of observed that we had almost no options. We called it the alternative right. That was a coinage between Richard Spencer and Paul Gottfried, because there literally was no alternative to the mainstream right unless you wanted to go into the shadowy underground of the white nationalist realm, which was almost completely dysfunctional at the time. There were some really bright lights, but there was also just mass insanity and people killing each other and stuff like that. So we were looking for an alternative that combined sort of the mental state of the mainstream right that was quieter and a little more balanced with some of the realizations about nationalism and the need for monoethnic societies that came out of the underground right. And the two fused, and I had been writing since the 90s about how diversity was just a terrible idea because it basically mathematically unable to work, unable to be functional, and would therefore be dysfunctional and destructive. And that sort of dovetailed together there. We also had neo-reaction going at the time, which sort of followed up on some of the ideas a lot of us have been kicking around in the 90s, which was that it looked like democracy had reached the end of its road. And so it was time to think about alternatives. And since we didn't really like the idea of dictatorships again, we were leaning toward aristocracy and monarchy. So those threads kind of came together. And that was an influence on the alt-right. I think ultimately the mainstream of the alt-right kind of went in a different direction, sort of merging the paleo-conservative and national socialist wing. But, they got most of the way there and got most of it right. So we're pretty thankful for that. But yeah, it was, those were hazy days, when everything was sort of up in the air and the internet was still newer. Social media hadn't completely taken over. And I was able to exercise a certain amount of influence, just writing things about philosophy and politics and history, basically, and where we were going as a society and the choices we'd have to make to avoid going straight down the path into the abyss and end up being, sort of a ruined third world place like a lot of the nations we see on Earth today. So it's been quite a trip. And now it's very hard to react, of course, because the mainstream has caught up with the alt-right and has sort of picked up on some of its basic ideas, but isn't yet really there to the, I don't want to say to the extreme, but to the point of having a clear goal about what it wants in the end. It's still sort of caught on the level of technique of like, oh, we really want to remove the illegal aliens, and we think maybe everyone should be Christian, and we want to end discrimination against white people. And all that's well and good, but I think those are steps on a path that's ultimately going to go in really a clearer direction that's going to be have less of sort of the surface complexity we have now, and more a few basic realizations about human life and sort of what we want as individuals out of it. So it's an interesting time. I think we're on the edge of something really large happening, that we in the alt-right always had thought about, but didn't really know when it was going to be triggered.
Okay, so hold on. You said several things there I wasn't aware of. First of all, okay, just to go back to the beginning, I had no idea that you'd been involved in this, say, since the 90s, and that any of this really even went back that far. I mean, I know about in the 90s, I assume there'd still be the what they called the first wave of, is it white nationalism or something, like, William Pierce and people like whatever you call them. But yes. I didn't know that there was neo reaction and this kind of like all this same talk was going. You were involved in it as far back as the 90s. So did you come out of the, like, basically out of the womb aware of these issues, or what turned you on to this kind of thing to begin with? Considering back in the 90s you wouldn't have had the internet we had in the 2010s and so forth. Like, how did you get involved in this information? Certain books you read, perhaps? Or...
Yes, definitely a lot of classical literature and philosophy, but also most people weren't on the internet, but I've been on the internet indirectly through the 80s because we had the ability to get on the various dial-up networks. I started out running bulletin boards and being a hacker.
No way.
Yeah, yeah, total nerd shit. And then moved on from that, sort of through an educational path, but also my own path, reading a whole lot of Plato and a whole lot of classical literature. And it became clear to me that no one could think anymore and that no one was thinking seriously about what we were doing. So when I got into the 90s, when political correctness was flowering, I was looking at that. I was saying, I'm culturally liberal, but conservative in every other way. And I appreciate what they want to be doing, but they're not doing it. What they are doing will instead achieve another result, and they're not going to like it. And my primary connection to liberalism was environmentalism. I wanted to stop the ecocide. I wanted to preserve all the nice little critters and plants that are going to be totally exterminated if we let humanity expand like spilling paint. And, which we are with urbanization and overpopulation. We're basically crushing any natural spaces where things can thrive on their own right, and they're getting replaced by generalists. But that had been my concern, and coming out of that, I realized that what we were trying to achieve was not going to be met by the methods we were using on the left, and that began a defection from that. And of course, these are the death metal years, moving into the black metal years, when there was sort of a rising feeling that whatever humanity thought was good was probably not good, and whatever it thought was evil probably contained in it something that we needed. And so
black metal and death metal, even at that, it was at the inception of your belief system.
Yes. I started out with honest thrash, which is that sort of punk metal hybrid like DRI, COC, Cryptic Slaughter, Dead Horse, Suicidal Tendencies.
Excellent. I love it.
Still favorites to this day.
Yeah, some of the best for sure.
Yeah. Half of Anus was probably inspired by DRI and Slayer lyrics on some level. The other half was probably Nietzsche and Plato.
See, I read Plato and so forth back in the 80s as well, and 90s. But I just came away. I just sort of I understood that there had been a great loss of culture and this thinking, and just the operation of their civilization and their religion was just so much superior. And I've always kept that with me ever since. But I don't know. I didn't see any kind of path to. I had the only thing I can say is I remember watching the TV shows of the time, the Ricky Lake and all this kind of shit. Remember that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
All that shit. And I remember just being like, feeling just deep down like that something offensive was happening that was like at the root of of like life itself. They were like going against something truly essential, and that we were heading down as dark a path as is imaginable through this kind of twinkly political correct stuff, and just this language of like, and everything was encapsulated in those shows. Even today, to me, this is how liberals think. They imagine the studio audience behind them hooting and hollering, "Yeah, you go, girl," or whatever, clapping. They even say, and then everybody clapped. And I just think it's like that. It's like that moral grandstanding where you get up and you say something like, gays are like everybody else. Everybody applauds, and you're like, I'm so munificent and universal.
Yeah, I
But
never
anyway,
trusted that. You know, I don't trust big groups and how they sort of converge on the stupidest thing possible. And when I
mm,
saw the ego competition, what Tom Wolfe calls status signaling, I was like, this is not good. There's rot in all of this. I mean, it's like if you were trying to fix a car, you know, you and a bunch of other guys, and you're standing around, you're like, well, the engine doesn't start. And everyone started talking about their feelings about it or their opinions about it, their judgments, their emotions. At that point, you start to get really nervous because you're like, well, no one's talking about how the goddamn engine works and therefore how we can fix the thing. It's basically like socially imposed schizophrenia. And those shows, the ones I always remember, Geraldo Rivera and
oh,
Jerry Springer, and
yeah,
they were just delighting in the decay. It was just like, oh, everyone's
yeah,
insane. Come join us and be insane together. And so it was
yeah.
like emo and
Maury,
and
remember Maury with his
yep,
paternity tests.
Maury Povich, yeah,
Maury
that guy.
Povich.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we'd all gone through the Satanic Panic as Slayer fans, you know, and that was a rough time. I mean, I remember people getting carded because Slayer albums were satanic. I
Mm,
remember books that were occult would not be, and that's a broad definition, and it just gets broader as people apply it. Books that were occult were not stocked in regular bookstores. You had to go to some specialized place and ask a dude who was really stoned that called himself the Druid if he had a copy. You know, I mean,
yeah.
it was a totally different world. And I think when you've seen that, you kind of do have a very cynical attitude toward that kind of mutual congratulations society where people are just telling each other how they've got the right opinions. And I'm saying, well, if we're worried about if the opinions are right, then we're no longer worried if they're correct. We're simply worried if they feel good to the group. And so you sort of get that sense of the mass hypnosis going on.
So it must have been a very lonely time then to have the awareness, this kind of awareness, basically the awareness you have now, way back in the '90s, or was it lonely, or was it not as lonely as it sounds?
You know, I've always accepted that most people aren't going to get it. So I just socialize with people on a normal level. I like people. I don't expect them to have to figure too much out because I know how busy people are, you know, with ordinary life, with trying to, back when we were kids, with trying to grow up, which is a whole lot of effort and kind of hard, you know, it's
Yeah.
difficult. And now, you know, people are caught up in families and jobs and stuff like
Oh yeah,
that. And so,
I do that as well. I didn't mean like literally lonely. I meant like metaphor,
oh,
like just in that there must have been almost nobody around if you did want to talk to somebody about this kind of stuff, or
oh
was it?
yeah, hell no. There,
Nobody.
other than a few people in black metal and a few white nationalists, there was nobody who was thinking about any of this stuff.
Right, right. And so, at what point did it begin to grow from there? Seeing as you were doing this so much earlier than I was, I'm just curious about this, the actual history of it.
Sometime around 2005, 6 ish, I noticed a real groundswell of people, especially younger people, coming up who were no longer buying into the mainstream options. And this was when, let's see, this was when Michel Houellebecq, his books were first translated into English. This
Hmm.
was when I guess Office Space had been a few years before, but there was just sort of a rise in negativity toward the way things were going. And it actually, the only parallel I can find to it is the 1920s, the Lost Generation. And it started to feel like that. And then we gained momentum. And I think having the second Bush term actually really accelerated things because people were just getting desperate. They were like, here we are in another war for democracy. Guys are coming home without legs and heads and stuff like that. And, you know, we're trying to somehow claim this is good, and yet nothing's going well. And so I think it really picked up then. And then starting in the 2010s, I guess that's when Richard Spencer started Alternative Right. And that brought a lot of people together to focus on that. And at the same time, somewhere in there, William Pierce died, and a bunch of
Yeah, I
the
remember.
other. Sorry.
Sorry, I remember when he died. I just thought of it. Yeah, I
Oh,
remember. Yeah,
yeah, he was a really interesting, intelligent man, and it was very sad that
yeah.
he passed on. But
He was
yeah,
He was like so forthright, and you listen to him, and it
yeah,
sounds like a crazy tirade. Even now, if I listen to it, it sounds like it sounds like a lunatic ranting. But then everything he says, if you slowly ingest it, is like, oh god, it's true, isn't it?
yep.
Uh,
He American Dissident Voices, right?
yeah,
Yeah, he did a
it's
really
amazing.
good
It's
job.
amazing.
But anyway, the old generation passed on, And I think naturally things switched to Generation Xers and a few alert millennials. And that's really where it all took off.
So that was really then through at the time, the freedom of the internet. And like, I think,
yes,
I remember, I don't remember the year. See, let's say I got red pilled around 14 or 13 years ago or so. With me, it started with some awareness of, it was during the invasions of, it was around the time of the Arab Spring.
Yes.
And
Okay.
all of this. And I remember seeing a news clip of some Muslims in the street of wherever it was. I don't know if it was, it must have been, what were the Tunisia, I guess, or I can't remember, but it's like in the street screaming, Allahu Akbar, and shooting up the street. And it just somehow dawned on me. I thought, imagine if I was out in the street. And not only was I shooting it with a machine gun, like everywhere I looked, but I was screaming, God is great. And it just had my little, I would never call myself a liberal. I thought I was a liberal, let's say. I thought I was like I had a normalish opinion where I was sort of ahistorical and apolitical. And I always liked a good racist, sexist joke, let's say. And I had read the classics like yourself, but I just sort of stayed out of politics, I guess. And maybe to some degree, that's a good thing to do still. I don't know. But that somehow dawned on me that there was a totally alien view to the world going on that was incompatible. And the world was not ultimately a matter of universal values or something like that. So that's when it happened for me. And what was my point of bringing that up? Shit. The fact that it was only 14 years ago. And based on what you were saying. So I think I became fully red-pilled because of that time. You were saying this happened around, say, 2005.
Sometime around that era, you know.
Is it, would you say, because just the internet was so free, like where you would look up, say, any old video, you might, the algorithm was literally just giving you related content of any kind for many years, in fact. So you would look up, say, anything randomly about genetics on YouTube, and then you could all of a sudden just be gleefully offered a video of Philip Rushton video on racial science or something.
Yeah.
And
it was basically like that. And also there was a second tier of forums that people were using. Places like the Fora, the Apricity, even Stormfront. And there was a lot of information passing back channel that way. So people knew what to look up. You know, I think for most of us, we had no idea where to start. You know, you type in like a beginner's guide to racism on Google. And even back then you didn't get much. But I mean, if you knew how to look up Francis Galton, you know, Felipe Rushton, Richard Lynn, people like that, you started to get a little more information trickling in. And that was the era too when HBD, human biodiversity, was a big thing. And so a lot of us were reading those blogs and also reading the MRA blogs, which were sort of the origin of red pilling and just recognizing that people are easily manipulated because they're accustomed to being manipulated. So you had better, if you're going to, for example, deal with the crisis of dating, you'd better be willing to manipulate or you're going to get manipulated. So it was a very interesting time.
So what were the original MRA blogs, would you say? Do you remember?
I wrote for The Spearhead, which was Matt Forney's old blog.
Really? So he was one of the originals, was he?
He was.
Was he? Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember all the others. I know that Roosh was around, and
he's gone completely now. I think Roosh vanished altogether.
I think he's now really concerned with religious matters. He used to run Return of Kings, great site, put some posts up there, but that sort of fizzled. I think he's more concerned with the religious side of things now. So he's kind of ducked out of the politics. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I liked about back then too, and this is where even say where you came into it as well for me. So back then you would go to these certain websites. When I wanted to get this forbidden information, you would find these websites. So there was like American Renaissance. There was the alt-right website, which was oh God, I can't remember his name. The Scottish guy and the other guy who, what are their names? I can't remember.
Colin Liddell.
Colin Liddell. And who's the other guy? I should know the other guy because he's.
I believe it was Richard Spencer.
No. There's another guy. It was Colin Liddell and oh God.
Oh, Andy Nowicki.
Andy Nowicki. That was
Nowicki. Okay.
Right. So they had a great little
website. Good dude.
They had the great little website that would sort of collate all the information because they could randomly publish American Renaissance or maybe one of yours or all these different people. I thought, but they would, so all these things were out there, and it was like, but what I liked about that era which is totally different to the way it is now, let's say. Because I'm not sure if you're aware of this. I'm sure you are. I'm sure you're secretly on social media. In fact, I know you are possibly. Something else I want to bring up to you afterwards. But,
For sure.
Back then, it was like different. So you had the MRA guys, you had the HBD people, and you had the neo-reactionary, whatever, right? But they didn't like fight with each other. They didn't like. They might have disagreements, but there was a broad agreement on the important topics, and there was a kind of spiderweb network of these different things that had these ideas and stuff, and that was great, I thought. Whereas now, everything's corralled onto social media, and they've sort of split up into these much gayer, kind of pointlessly sort of nepotistic and just oppositional groups. You have like your Bronze Age pervert group, or your Nick Fuentes Groyper's guys, or they sort of split up into these kind of things, and no one gets along. Where there was a great strength in the old way, where everyone was doing their own thing, and you may not totally agree with everything the men's rights guys were doing. I certainly didn't. There was some rubbish in there for sure, but everybody kind of, it was this great amorphous mass. I don't know, and it wasn't so oppositional. I liked that's what I liked. That's what I get nostalgic about.
Me too. We sort of realized we were not of the mainstream, and that we were people outside. You think about like a campfire, and all the cool kids are sitting around the campfire, and all the not so cool kids who really badly want to be cool kids are sort of trying to crowd their way in. And then there's a bunch of us off smoking menthols in the trees, and that's who we were. And so we were much more accepting of each other. I totally agree about the cliques now. I think it's insane, since we have much more in common than we lack. There's no point to this kind of weird infighting and posturing, but this is what always happens. Same thing happened to metal. People have to make a name for themselves, so they try to be as distinctive as possible. This is sort of the root of identity. Identity is what makes you distinctive in some way. And elective identity, at least. Obviously, national identity less so, unless you consider on a global scale. But I think people are just looking for a way to have them to adorn their personalities in such a way that they seem unique and seem interesting to other people. I think their concerns are much, much more local than we're thinking. They just want friend groups that understand them, and they have some things they can agree on. It's sort of like sports. Why do people watch sports? Well, because you have something you can talk about for hours without having to really worry about thinking too much. Who's gonna punt the ball, who's gonna take it down the field, all that good shit, who's gonna win the championship or whatever. And I think in the same way, a lot of these cliques, it's just about having enough shared tokens that you can converse effortlessly and not have to worry that someone's going to disagree with you. When you're in your clique, you're basically repeating the dogma, and so everyone's on board with you, and you can have a social group. And I think that's what's driving the current division into these little cliques.
Yeah, it's like a whole new way to organize people socially, I guess, in the social media. And there's just less kind of, there's still freebooters out there that just go where they want, which is a good way to do it, I guess. But I wish they wouldn't be so stridently oppositional. Say certain ones would be like, either you're Catholic or you're out. If you're pagan, fuck you, or the neo reactions and the National Socialists hate each other supposedly. I don't know. Whatever, there's always it should be, at least I always try to be forgiving of anybody who's at least broadly correct, or at least appears to be pushing at something that should be pushed back against in some way.
Yeah, I think what's happened in many ways is we've gotten lapped. Mainstream politics has caught up with the biggest parts of what we were talking about that was outside the norm. It hasn't caught up on the religion question yet, but I think at the same time, we're now able to.
How do you mean caught up? You mean they've routed us and like contained us somehow?
They've adopted what we were talking about. We have Trump in the White House. He's talking about essentially nationalism. He calls it Christian nationalism, but he's very clearly pro-white. And I think you have European leaders all across the spectrum, not just Hungary and France, but in Germany now too, and in England, talking about, we really think we should be a mono-ethnic society. They're not quite putting it in those terms, but everyone's kind of gravitating toward that. So kind of what kept us out of the campfire, to use my sort of dumb little metaphor, was that we would talk about race. That was the dividing line. And
You're
it's
right.
still kind of is. You know, I mean, but if you went on in public anywhere and talked about race or social class and genetic differences, you were out. And if you talked about nationalism, you were out. And God help you if you mention eugenics. But I think now those things are much more floating into the mainstream consciousness. So what kept us all in our little group of outsiders where we could converse with each other is no longer there. And so we've become granulated, and everyone's sort of competing for their different vision to win. And of course, all the people in these little groups are depending on these narratives that the groups advance, because those narratives make them feel better about their lives. So if you criticize that or differ from it, it's viewed as hostile, even if you don't mean it that way. I think that's what's happened now.
I do think myself, and this is conspiratorial, and I won't name names about who I think is what or this and that. I do think some of the groups are in fact even the system manufactured kind of response, trying to even capture our energy, as it were, or the energy of those days and reframe it in their own way. Some of them,
Without a doubt.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I'm not crazy.
No. I mean, back in the white nationalist days, we fully acknowledged that half of the people in the movement were informers or somehow subsidized by the government. No,
So
I'm not kidding.
Really? Is that how it was? Fully half, yeah? Is that the way it is all the time, you think?
I think starting in the 70s, the feds got involved, and when the internet was around, it got easier to hunt people down. So yeah, now a lot of these are just your standard informer is someone who's involved with a far-right group, gets caught doing something illegal, usually drugs or guns, and while he's sitting there in the police station, a nice man comes in a suit and says, you know, I can make all this go away, and you're going to get some money, but you're going to have to give me information every month. And I think, yes, half of them were. There were an awful lot of people floating around the far right at that time who had zero visible means of support, and yet somehow were still around, you know, week after week, month after month. And I think that was federal money, definitely. Informants are a super powerful way for law enforcement to get inside groups. There's almost no other way. I mean, it's very hard to get warrants to just blanket surveil a group for 2 years or whatever. But if you have an informant inside, he waits until somebody does something illegal, then tells them about it. Then they get a warrant for that based on the informant. And that's how law enforcement works in America. And I think they had an awful lot of people on the inside. I think every membership list got leaked. You know, they're just, anytime you had a group, you became a target, and they found a way to get someone inside. You know, maybe they did it just for people who were very vulnerable in terms of needing money. You know, your mother needs to get her gallbladder out or something, and you know, $10,000 short, and there comes the nice man in a suit, and he says, you know, I can make your problem go away, but you know, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So you need to, you know, come forth with some information. I really need this membership list. But I think that's how they compromised us, and I think that the same thing occurs now. What's worse, though, you're probably going to laugh at this because it's a very metal topic and a very punk topic. I think it's just commercialization. I think there's a lot of people selling out now just to make a buck because they can. We're an industry now. You know, back in the early 90s to early 2000s, even maybe the early 2010s, I wouldn't say the far right was any kind of industry. We were viewed as the weird kids who smelled funny and sat at the back of the classroom, you know. But now we're kind of in the mainstream. So, I mean, if you want to get rich and famous, one way to do it is go hang around the far right and get famous and then put out your product. And it's funny how many of these guys have products, you know. So I think that's the bigger threat.
You're right. It is funny. So let's keep that in mind, because it feels like everything, all that classic era of growth ended with, it culminated in Charlottesville, and then they censored everything on the internet, and there was really depressing few years. Even though I hung in there. I had sites I maintained on all the Facebook and Twitter and so forth, but I was just kind of like I really didn't have the heart. I would keep posting now and then, and because I always had my book. I'm always my whole point of being on the internet was just to show my original book, my art book, and now my other books as well. But so I got lost in this political stuff because there was always my political awareness tainted my. In fact, all I've ever tried to do is sort of cultural things, like artistic things, and not be overly particularly political. It just happens to be that I believe to be true in doing this, I have to be aware of these pitfalls, and anything resembling what they call woke or whatever destroys any kind of art utterly, completely. So you have to have an awareness of it and step around it. But I don't, for all the talk and all this, awareness and feds and so forth being involved. Like all I've ever done, I think you yourself with the Death Metal Underground, like we're both just around to comment on culture and produce our own art, and just be free to do so properly without too much
all
hindrance.
I wanted to do was smoke weed and listen to death metal, but then in came the world,
even more humble a goal.
Yeah, I mean, you got to have goals in life. You might as well pick something achievable, right? But when I started in the 80s, in about the early to mid 80s, there was a huge crackdown on hackers, and most of us just wanted to share information and learn how to do things. It wasn't
Right.
like the easy internet days where if you're curious about how some gadget works, you just type the name in a search engine. You had to go to libraries, and there were a lot of documents that were not actually published. So you had to go find them in dumpsters, or you had to break in or bullshit your way in and get a hold of a copy. And that's a lot of what we did. And we also, borrowed machines and phone lines and stuff like that to do that and to learn about the systems and all that. But there was a huge free speech crackdown going on the bulletin boards back then. People were getting banned for using obscenities. Obviously, if you said anything white nationalisty, you got banned. If you said anything too occult by someone else's definition, usually, you also got banned. And so and this was on private systems. Bulletin boards were dial up. You'd call a computer at someone else's house. You'd log on and send messages to other people. That computer might connect to another computer that connected to the internet and sent your messages worldwide, depending on how complex their setup was. But the fact is that this was all privatized, but people were still cracking down and trying to avoid controversy. And I think what I learned from that was if you try to dance around and not just state what you mean, you're going to get censored. It's just going to take a little longer, and you're never going to actually get to a clear picture of what you're trying to communicate. And so I think when the internet started going to social media and the censorship kicked in, and I think 2013 to 2015 was when it really started up, and we were all just kind of dodging it as best we could, or lucky enough to be missed by it just by the luck of the draw. But when that kicked in, I think it called to mind everything I'd learned back in the day, which was that, you kind of have to push back as hard as you can. And at some point, you're probably going to get taken out, but it's better to do that and make the point than it is to, try to pretend everything's normal. I mean, back in the 80s, they were claiming that if you sent a swear word over an interstate phone line, that was a felony. And they were trying to bust people simply for possession of copies, typed, digitally reproduced copies of Bell documents. Someone sat down with the original document and typed all the words into their little Apple IIe or whatever, and the feds wanted to arrest people like that. And so I sort of felt where things were going. I agree Charlottesville really tore the lid off everything, and that's when I saw the dragnet bans happening, where they were just banning anyone associated with anything and trying to sort of get this false unity thing going. So it's been quite a mess.
Until Musk bought Twitter, it was pretty dismal.
Yes.
Right. Have you tried the Telegram? Do you have a Telegram account? Okay.
No. I haven't made it there yet. Sorry.
Well, you should. I'd say you'd like that one. It's pretty free. As far as they go, it's the freest one going. It'll remind you of the old days, I think.
Okay.
It's pretty good. Yeah, I really would recommend it. And I think, actually, I'll bring this up now. A friend of mine, I don't know for sure that it's you, but like one of my friends who was like, you're talking to the death metal guy. One of my friends on X, and she was like, he's on, you like yelled at him and blocked him on X. I was like, what? And like she pointed to an account she thinks is you. I won't say what it is because maybe it's anonymous or whatever. And you made and I looked at it, I was like, what the fuck is this? You made some totally like milquetoast remark about Soros, if it is you, something or other. And I was like, fuck you. And I blocked you. I don't know. And I looked at it, I was like, what? Why was I such a testy little bitch over this? Like I had no clue why if it is you, I don't know what was going on that I reacted so badly.
No
Maybe
worries.
I was being harassed by some other people. If that is you, and I think it is, I apologize for that, and I unblocked you.
Well, thank you. I do have it.
I had a tiff with him. Like, what are you talking about? She showed me this thing, and I was like, holy fuck, what's with that reaction? Maybe I was drunk or something. I don't know.
It can happen. I do have a Twitter account now. I am Sodom Goat, I think. Or
that's it. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
I unblocked you.
You need a username no one else wants, right?
Okay, so that's the other thing I wanted to ask you. So you mentioned the occult stuff a couple of times. Are you like, is that something you're seriously into, or I assumed you were sort of a atheist type, or what's the story there?
You know, no, gosh, that's hard. That's a hard one. I read Plato and took him seriously. I also read the old pagan texts and was very fond of those, not just the Greeks, but the Nordic ones. Was fond of Hinduism, and just thought, I've never been able to be an atheist. I think most of us who end up transitioning through atheism basically just want to escape from Christianity. And to me, I just wanted a clearer picture. And I think Platonism made sense with that. One of the stepping stones, of course, was perennialism, Huxley's formulation of just finding basically the commonality between all the great religions. And I think then if you spend enough time kicking around with advanced philosophy from the German idealist school, meaning not the stuff that later glossed over and kind of made it happy and sort of neutered. I think once you spend enough time with Schopenhauer, with Kant, um, and related thinkers, you move on to thinking in terms of German idealism. And from that, Hinduism and paganism are just a step. I also discovered New Thought, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but was sort of a American English movement mostly to sort of capture the essence of the occult without any of the adornments. They did not want to be sacrificing bats in the basement with people who thought they were doing something significant but were probably not. They just wanted to have a scientific understanding, and that sort of led me back to Plato and to taking Platonism much more seriously. And that, I think, is a perfect balance. It's not like the symbolic religions, which I think are very crazy, and it's not to the point of atheism, which I think also denies far too many things. I have no beef with agnosticism, and I understand, in my view, some people are born atheist, meaning that they just don't have whatever wiring it is to be concerned with the beyond and the structure of everything and the origins and all that. And I think that's respectable too. I mean, I'm not, like you said, I don't want to join one of the cliques, right? But for me, Platonism works, and I think it makes a lot more sense and ties together a lot of threads of New Thought, of paganism, and what's generally called the occult beliefs, the hidden beliefs, the camouflage beliefs, which is essentially just esotericism. And I think that the nice thing about it is that no one would understand what I'm on about, which is good, because what made these old religions graceful in part was that they were esoteric. And so there were a few things you sort of accepted on the surface, but to really understand them and to get any kind of connection with them, which was required to understand them, you had to go deeper, and that wasn't for everyone. And that kind of kept a limit. I mean, you couldn't have a televangelist in these philosophies. I mean, people have tried it. The law of attraction people are the most successful version of that. But I don't think they get very far, and I don't think it lasts very long, because these are not visually rewarding or tangible faiths. And so I got into all that, and I'd say, yeah, I've been writing about various occult and pagan traditions for a long time. My publisher for my first book put out a number of compilations for a decade, maybe before that. And I wrote about Northern traditions, about the crossover with Hinduism, scientific Hinduism, so to speak, and some of the other ideas from New Thought and how they all connected with philosophy, putting them sort of more in terms that someone who had come up in an understanding of Western philosophy would associate with. And so it's been a long, strange trip, but I think that, when you're a teenager, you flee from a lot of the things that your parents believe in because they're wrong. And it takes a long time to build back what those are substitutes for.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad to hear you say you're a fellow Neoplatonist, because that was always for me, the great summation of spirituality and religion and philosophy and everything. And I've always advocated for it, but it's such a hard thing when you confront a truly religious person, a Christian or others, it seems very hard to explain somehow, because isn't it? It's sort of because you don't have the kind of the mathematical eloquence of Plato at your disposal to sort of really get into the full details of it. And so much of it is just like doubting everything, and like the Socratic back and forth of like questioning everything right to the tits, right down to the tiniest detail, and realizing how very little you can precisely know or speak logically as a factual, and all this kind of thing. But like, I know that absolute inner peace I've gotten from this, and like a kind of, I don't know, I don't feel. That's the best way I can describe it. Is like, there's no, religious people say someone who's a devout Christian. I think they always have a bit of a conundrum of faith where they have to, there's a bit of a ridiculous story that they have to kind of force themselves to believe to fully be on board for everything they need to believe. And there's always a bit of a back and forth there, where with something like Platonism, you have a kind of rational understanding of an interpretation of the world or something that is spiritual as well, but sort of, how can I explain it other than peace of mind, but like an understanding and a peace with the world. And like, you see people getting stressed about things, and you just know it cannot happen to you through this understanding. And even now, my words are failing to even.
Well, here's what I'd say. I'd say that Christianity looks for spiritual truth in symbols. It's basically updated idol worship. And so if the symbols fail you, your religion fails you. Platonism, occultism, paganism, Hinduism, you look into nature and you find inductively a spiritual truth there. So that can never be taken from you, because you are not depending on magic words or symbols or superstitions. You're instead saying, this is a logical universe, therefore it's going to have these properties, therefore I trust in these. And I think that's the inner peace you're talking about. There is trust, and there is the original meaning of faith, which is that you believe that no matter how shitty things get, there is something to this experience, to this human experience we're having, and there is an order to this universe that is always pushing us towards something good, even through really harsh means like natural selection. I mean, if you ever had known someone who's been killed suddenly, and it just seems completely pointless, you're always like, you always see the people in the Hollywood movies like, why, God, why? But, you do kind of feel that a little bit. But when you're in the more naturalistic frame of mind, you're like, yeah, chaos and randomness are part of life, and we don't really understand what's going on behind the scenes always. Sometimes tragedies have to happen. And oftentimes after a tragedy, you get much more clarity, you get much more growth. And so even though you miss your dead friends, you're like, well, something good came of all that. So yeah, I think there's a total inner peace, and I think it comes from everything matching up, all of the parts working together, and everything making sense finally. And I don't think Christianity can give that to people. And I think it's a very cruel religion in many ways, because their faith is based on these very narrow pillars. And if anything happens to one of those, I think these people experience something like a schizophrenic decompensation. And that must be incredibly existentially stressful.
Yeah. And you can see it in them too. Yeah. Because the world is bifurcated into good and evil as well, right? Forbidden and not and allowed. Everything is one or the other kind of thing. So it's kind of, it becomes very schizophrenic, I think.
Yeah.
But,
modernity, schizophrenic.
I can even in pagan belief, or in sort of, if you through paganism, etc., you can get into and even Platonism, you can get into a certain magical belief still, and certainly that you learn about magic numbers and things, and you can feel like there's perhaps systems of luck, which all this is sort of spoken about in these old texts and things, and you wonder about it maybe that they're just in the same way, and in the observance of nature that you're talking about, that things are so inexplicable and happen for such reasons that are very abstract and difficult for humans to fully grasp, that there can be hidden portent in things you would never expect, like the amount of times you do something or numbers. I mean, this is extremely schizophrenic, but I don't know. There's you can have a bit of that in the sort of pagan.
Anyone who doubts that, I think I have a simple solution for them. I think they should learn to play guitar, because once you start working over and over again with 12 notes, because there's only 12 notes, And once you start working with patterns and repetition and duration, things like that, experiencing even things like texture, timbre, you start to see the world differently, because you start to see how very similar combinations can have radically different results. And I think part of paganism is chaos theory. It recognizes that as events as they present themselves to you are not showing you the essence. There is a cause-effect relationship. The cause is bigger than the effect, and the cause involves a lot of moving parts. It's very rarely as simple as the boy kicked the ball. The boy needs gravity, he needs sunlight, he needs a lawn to do it on, he needs someone to make the ball and give it to him, he needs someone to get him out of school so he can do it. That's cause. Cause in a Platonic sense is all of the factors in the fact pattern that are going to contribute to that event being able to happen, or becoming inevitable that it would happen. And so once you start looking, when you look at music and you look at how influential numbers are in that, you stop seeing them as numbers and you start seeing them as patterns. And once you discover patterns and think of them in a causal sense in your world, you start to think, this may have some influence on me. For example, it's the middle of the night. Let's just say you're sleeping soundly. Something wakes you up. You go and check it out. Well, there's nothing. Maybe it was the cat. You go back to bed. A little while later, you wake up again. You go check it out. Nothing. So you go back to bed. The third time you wake up, you better not go back to bed. Something is afoot. What is it they say?
Yeah, three is a very...
3 times is enemy action. So yeah, twice as coincident.
3 is the number. 3 is something. 3, there's something. 2, 3, and not only 2, 3. This is something I've personally noticed. I know what you think of this. That, because I remember talking to that guy, that guy. What's the guy? Kurt Doodle. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah.
Remember, he was part of that one group. What are they called? Proprietarians. They had their own crazy thing, but that was another loosely associated thing that used to be around, not around anymore. But he was like, everything breaks down is made of pyramids, and it's 3 points in a pyramid, and it is mathematically so, and it's certainly in terms of fractals and eternity and spirals, it does break down to these things. So it's not just literally mathematically in the order of things. 3 is a sacred combination, but to me, in the 3, it's not just, there's like two. There has to be an element where it's slightly off, where the third thing is slightly apart or away or disjointed from the other two, and then that is some kind of magical combination of things. And it sounds so schizophrenic and crazy. I know. We're trying to be incredibly rational.
What you're describing is the necessity of cycles. If you're going to have any kind of cycle, you need it to be not fully symmetrical, so that there is a void created, so that it repeats.
And that's eternity.
Sure. I mean, I think there's, I think in everyday life we see things, I always tell people, it's like they talk about mathematical equality, and I'm like, well, I've never seen 5 equal apples. Everything is different. And I think when you see like a pattern appear, let's use the 3 for an example, when the third happens, there's a pressure there for something else to happen. The scene has to.
That's so well put. A pressure for something else to happen. You may come back and read that somewhere else. That is so well put.
Thank you. But anyway, I think the point is that things are asymmetrical and irregular and unequal in life, so that there's always a little bit of suction pulling something else to happen. Because otherwise, if you think about designing the universe, if you were going to write it on a computer, someone said, okay, here's a C compiler, write a fucking universe, man. You say, okay, well, I better make it so that it never hits a stop state. Every event has to invoke another event, so that everything doesn't just stall, divide by 0 type error thing, so you end up making things unequal. And so I think that what you're describing is when a cycle is near completion, the final strike has to be a little bit off, so that something else can attach to it.
And that actually pertains to everything we're talking about culturally and with the alt-right, et cetera, as well, because you always think it's going to follow some recognizable pattern and come back to exactly where it was, and we're going to follow some event in history and it's going to be just like this or that. But I always think, no, life and evolution will always surprise you and change in a way you will never expect. So you're right. It'll be so. Who put it this way? Who's that old science fiction writer? He wrote, I think, the Illuminatus trilogy. Do you know what I'm talking about? Colin Wilson, was it, or one of those guys?
Sounds
One
right.
of these guys. One of these guys.
Yeah.
He was like, life will never resolve itself. You will never see some outcome you're expecting or hoping for. It will just get weirder and change in some unexpected way that totally fucks you up. So even in all our efforts we're talking about with immigration or this culture war thing, it will probably just never just sort of fix itself and resolve. Things will change in a dramatic other fashion, and just go off on some other fucking tangent that none of us could ever guess.
Well, I like the saying that history may not repeat, but it loops. And I think that's true. We might get the results we want, but there's going to be other stuff added in there that we probably couldn't anticipate. I mean, I think 1970s sci-fi, they called the struggle with China. They were like, yeah, by the time humanity is sufficiently advanced, it's going to be the West versus China. But they all predicted that we would have had a nuclear war by now. So, I mean, things aren't quite as linear as they seem. And you got to be ready for the fact that in order to get to the place where you want to go, you may go through some other weird places. I mean, this is straight up what makes Lord of the Rings interesting, right? You're going on this simple mission. You're like, oh yeah, this ring's evil. Well, let's destroy it. Oh, well, we can't destroy it. You got to go to this, through all these weird lands and meet all these weird people and end up at this weird mountain where you can possibly destroy it. And that's what good quests, good adventures are made from. And I know this might seem like projecting literature onto life, but I don't think that's entirely irrational, given that literature is intensely inspired by life. But just I think that life always wants to be interesting. There always has to be a mystery to it. There has to be some kind of quest, something going on, so that it all stays relevant. Otherwise, I mean, you kind of get becalmed. We talk about heat death, right? Where every option is about as good as any other option. Well, there's a good way to avoid that, and it's conflict, And I think that's how nature's designed, and I think it's designed very intelligently that way, even if it's not always, to my personal advantage when, I don't know, something breaks or the toilet explodes or whatever.
Well, we always have to fight. We always have to fight for what we think is right, and and what we can think is good. And certainly there will be downturns and black periods and all this and that. But just that, I don't think I didn't mean to say that as like to excuse anything or anything else. Just that, like even say now, even how it is now. Like when you were saying before, that now we are actually much more accepting of our beliefs from the 2010s and earlier. It's much totally mainstream. People are talking about race and so forth. And like, yeah, it's hard to. It feels like we're still so limited in what we can say and what is being talked about by the elite. But you're right. It is much more. It is really out there everywhere now.
Yeah.
So that is a great triumph. And it's almost like I almost didn't notice it in some ways, I guess. But just because there's so many other levels to it of where it's still not quite right, or it's being hijacked and being used in certain ways, or the fact that nothing's really changed in terms of open borders. It just doesn't change anything somehow. I don't know, but
I dicked around with computer modeling a little bit back in the day, because I've dicked around with most parts of computing because I thought it was fun. I know it's nerd shit. Don't judge me. But what keeps you up at night when you make a model for something is, do I know all the parts? Because if you miss even a small part, that can have a huge influence. And so I think you're totally right. I don't think things are going to manifest as we visualize them. Life never gives you what you want. You always have to be careful. You ask the gods for something, you ask the gods for something general, and you're going to get served good and hard. For example, you ask the gods to make you rich, you get run over by a steamroller, and then you get a huge payment because, hey, you're now a flat person, so you're going to get all this money or whatever. You have to, you have to think of it in terms of, it's more like a tree. Branches grow, branches develop, and then at some point, branches fall off, stuff like that. But in any case, the changes that happen are often subtler and involve a lot more moving parts than we visualize. So all we can do is strive toward very general things. I mean, for example, I always say that in a huge part of my political writing, what I'm aiming for is simply realism. I just want us to get much more realistic in terms of consequences in physical reality, as opposed to thinking in terms of symbols and emotions and judgments and all that stuff the Buddhists warn you about. And I think that that's very achievable. I think saying we need monoethnic states is very achievable. How is it going to happen? What are all the bends on the path? I have no idea. I do not pretend to be that smart, and I think no one should, because no one can compete with the majesty of the universe. But I think we're going there, and I think that part of it is we're here for a reason and conscious for a reason. And I think the biggest part of it is making choices. And I think very few people make choices. In fact, I think they try to avoid it. And it often is simply an intellectual process where you're like, you know what? I've thought about everything and I want option A over option B, or I simply want to move in a direction toward this thing. And I think most people find that really challenging and really scary. And that's why it's a huge part of the occult practice, is just focus like that. So I think that when we make choices and when we orient ourselves towards something, we're getting closer to it. As far as all the other shit that it may invoke or the path that it's going to take, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's a good summary. So Bob says, some guy called Bob says, is eternity good or bad in your view? So Bob, that's an inherently Christian framework question. Like, you know,
is eternity good or bad? Wow, what a good question. You know, I think this is going to sound very postmodern and hermeneutic, but I think we first have to look at what do we mean by eternity. Because if we're talking about heaven where I sit on a cloud and I eat a donut that is never fully consumed for eternity, no thank you. If you mean the world without end, the endless adventures, the endless new things to experience, well, that's kind of consistent with reincarnation when you think about it. You die, you're in the Platonic view, your soul existed before you were made incarnate. So after your incarnate time ends, you move on to another time, another place where you are incarnate, and you keep doing the same things you do in this existence. You struggle, you strive, you overcome. I think those rules are part of the universe because they're necessary for logical consistency and cannot be escaped. So when someone says, you know, what do you think about eternal life? I no longer visualize the cloud and the donut. I think that would be terrible. I visualize it's more like being on a long boat voyage and you stop on different islands and the voyage never ends because there's always another island. Does that answer the question, you think?
Right. I'm not sure if his question had that amount of depth. I was just thinking it was inherently Christian. Is it good or bad? Because if you, along the lines of what you just said, you don't even ask if things are good and bad. You know, first of all, things are as they are. But overall, you know, I would say good. I would say good in that all of creation, and how can you complain about it? You know, even if
it's to have knowledge of it.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
I mean, in that context, you know, you say, is eternity good or bad? And to your point, we say, well, it's inherent, it's part of existence, but existence tends toward the good as far as we know it. And I use these terms really in the Platonic sense of good and bad versus good and evil. Good is just whatever is flourishing, and bad is whatever fails and is dysfunctional. You know, I mean, you know, good is original black metal, bad is war metal or something. I don't know, emo metal, metalcore or something. But you know, in the sense of is the universe good? I'm going to defer to your point. Say, yeah, I think it is. I mean, this is a pretty amazing existence. We're very lucky to have it, and if I'm right, eternity is part of it. It's just not a static eternity where you just eat that donut forever and live in this perpetual state of happiness and all that good shit. Because I think that would be very boring, and I think that would enervate your soul. So I don't think the universe would do that to us.
Yeah, like there's certain things we can say without doubt as logical statements, utterly Socratically logical. First of all, that we're all living through some kind of experience, and it is something has been set in motion, right? Also, yes. That if the only thing we can latch onto as a permanent, unchanging thing, as far as we know, is change, and that's going to change perpetually in inexplicable ways, and that is perhaps the mechanism of its continuance, potentially eternally.
Yeah, I think
like the option that it's finite and the option that it's eternal are both insane.
Yeah,
but yeah, you know, the fact that it's here at all says to me that probably it's eternal. Because why would it bother if it's finite and there's a absolute nothingness after it? Why bother in the first place? Why bother at all?
Yeah, I think also, I mean, eternal is skewed from our human perspective. We're thinking in terms of limits. I don't think it would think in terms of limits. It thinks in terms of consistency. And so at that point, unless there's a reason for it to stop, it wouldn't. Some of the most interesting research these past couple of weeks has involved theoretical treatment of black holes and how it's possible that they are actually reducing entropy in the universe by sucking out matter and doing something with it. And that possibly there's something on the other side, including in the multiverse theory, that black holes are literally creating new universes within themselves in some other dimension or some other rotation. And I think that's consistent with, this is the root of logic, to your point. Logic is consistency. And I think we're looking for whatever is consistent with everything we know of reality. And I would say consistency says, yes, there is, life just keeps going on. You go on to some other place, you have new adventures, you never get really bored. You always have something to do. There's always something, and your soul determines how you approach that. And you're there sort of to have a learning experience, and it's going to happen in what we're familiar with and in many other ways as you pass between different incarnations. And I think that makes perfect sense. That's consistent. The donut and the cloud, I don't know, man. That stuff, yeah, I think that's more based on a fear of what might happen. We're all sort of, there's always the possibility that death is simply animal death, and when the lights go out, there's nothing. We no longer exist. And I think that if you think about it too much, it'll scare the crap out of you. But I think that that's rather inconsistent with the way this universe keeps information sort of in cycle, and it keeps energy cycling. I think it keeps souls cycling. I think we have a purpose here. I think there is an order to things in which at least some of us make sense. Now, I always bring up meat suit theory, which is that there's about 144,000 real humans, and everyone else is just a walking meat suit that responds to their desires, judgments, and feelings only. But that's like extreme eugenics, right? So we probably shouldn't talk about that.
Well, I do ascribe to that too. I call them normals, and I would love to if I was a billionaire, I would be conducting psychological studies on like average people, absolutely, and trying to get to the bottom of it. I personally think there's like a bit of a syndrome going on in the modern world, similar to psychopathy, very similar, in that, and it's like rampant, and it's like more so than it used to be in the past, and it's to do with the way psychopaths emulate emotions.
Mm.
Normals have this business where they may almost be, not that they're free of independent thought, but everything is through a prism of social acceptance. Everything. There's almost no personal opinion outside of social, some kind of social framework. I don't know, something like this.
No.
I often think about this, anyways, and that
think-
it can apply to almost literally anything where you can, apparently where you can like groom their daughter, or you see these parents after what was the recent one? The kid was stabbed and the father was like,
Carmelo.
Yeah, this kind of thing. It's like what can be going on behind such a person? The psychology of that person.
Yeah, I think most people are pretty much stimulus response types, and I wonder how you would study them psychologically, because I think you're right. They're acting like real people. And
it's like psychopathy. You're right. And what's behind it? Nothing at all. Just because what? This is. I'm extremely curious about it.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's it. No, that's all. I mean, whatever.
Oh, I was just going to bring up Spinoza's stone, where the philosopher Spinoza talked about, if you asked a stone flying through the air if it meant to do that, it would say, "Of course I did, you idiot." And I think that that's how most people are. There's a certain level of complexity at which you get the ability to make choices. And if you don't have that level of complexity, you're essentially a big bag of impulses, and your ego picks whichever one seems least likely to get you in trouble. And I think that most people are acting like human beings. They're studying other human beings. They depend on social importance because that's their chance of being important, because they realize there's basically nothing within. So, we might as well ask, why does a yeast convert sugars into alcohol? Because it's its nature. Why are the meat suit people meat suits? Because that's the limit of their complexity, and it's in their nature as a result. So I think you're onto something there.
Right. I would like to know. I'd like to know more about them, which is hilarious to treat them and study them like they're something wrong with them. And we're talking about what 70% of everybody. We're
A
the
lot higher
weirdos.
than that. Yeah.
Probably, yeah,
Well,
maybe.
I mean, do we think there's something wrong with them, or do we think they're just? It's like an ecosystem, right? You have a whole lot of mice. Some of them are going to live to the end of natural lives and die of natural causes. Others are going to be taken out by disease or predators. And I think that if you are going to, or if you're a tree, you're going to have 10,000 seeds, three of which grow to maturity. There's always got to be extras in the movie. And I think that's what the meat suit people are.
Yeah. So they're born slaves, really.
Yes. They're prey
Yeah.
animals.
Yeah. And but and this is the thing, they've been harnessed to become the power force, especially in modernity, since the techno edifice has invented all this media stuff and all this social control stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's whoever can understand how they work and motivate them has the power, I think.
Yes.
No? Am I wrong?
That's democracy. That's demotism, as
That's
we
democracy.
call it in neo-reaction.
So
But
how
yeah,
do they know? How do they know exactly what to say? Because I can never tell. Whenever I see something take off in a trend amongst normals, it's something inexplicable to me. Like I have no understanding of what has ignited in them this interest. Because it's usually something sort of inane that you've seen several before and stupid. But I just can't. If you were to reliably predict and create viral normal ideas, I wonder how it works. Because it's not just a matter of
I
being stupid and so forth. There's something, I don't know, what is it? Something that appeals to the ego, to like a superficial
I think
impulse.
you give people some. Well, there was that great essay, "The Cathedral and the Bazaar," and in it, Eric S. Raymond talked about how very well designed things fail to things that are kind of slobby but give everyone a job. And so I think the thing is, whatever gets popular is usually something that gives people a chance to talk about it and have their own take on it. It enables their participation, therefore, it makes them feel powerful. I think it's generally a mystery, but there are some people who are clearly wizards with it. I mean, Donald Trump is a wizard at knowing how to be politically entertaining. And I think he knows the number one rule in politics is whoever's the most entertaining wins. So he comes up with this stuff. I mean, who even knows if the spat with Elon Musk is for real? But he comes up with this stuff that you simply can't look away from. It's like a car crash, and you're like, oh, I need to see the car crash. And I think that, I look at other people.
Are you sure it's some genius on his part though, and not just
It could be chaos.
Can't we be sure of that?
But I mean, or you look at people who like know how to manipulate the pop audience. I mean, your Taylor Swifts and your Steven Spielbergs. Somehow they know what everyone's going to like, and I think it's because at some level they like it themselves and they just sort of fetishize it. Or who was the guy who did Kill Bill? What was his name?
Tarantino.
Tarantino. Yeah, I think that dude totally just sat around getting stoned and watching movies, and I think he really just figured out what makes a movie appealing, and so he had all this string of hits that, to be honest, were pretty good movies.
Well, see, that's a good example. That is a good example because I did really like his early films. Reservoir Dogs, right up to Pulp Fiction. Reservoir Dogs. He wrote True Romance, which is a great movie as well, and then Pulp Fiction. But after that, he was shit. It was Jackie Brown was boring, and then it was like all this kind of PC bullshit with I didn't like any movie he made after that at all.
Sure.
And it seemed like derivative and stupid and just like he had no ideas. It was all gone. But his early movies were very good. So that's a good example in terms of somebody who you think holds the magic. But I know with like average people, he rode the coattails of his early success. But they were good, I thought, his early films. And they were totally just from obsessively watching 70s films, which was a very gritty era for film where people were trying to be extremely real. And there'd be a lot of racism and violence, and he had those in those films as well. He had like that scene in True Romance with what's the guy? I can't remember the actor's name. Shit, where the Italian guy is sitting down with his father, Do you have seen the movie True Romance?
It's been a while. I don't really remember it.
It's been a while. Well, I will use euphemisms, but this Sicilian gang is going to kill his father, and they're torturing him, and they're saying, "Tell us what we want to know, or we're going to torture you more." And he sits back and he goes, "Give me a cigarette." And he goes, "You guys are Sicilians, yeah? You know Sicilians are descendants of N-word." And he goes on with a long speech about how the Moors conquered Sicily, like a long, slow speech, incredibly racist. And it's like, oh yes, that's excellent.
Well, it's only 8%, we think. Yeah.
Well, I know. I mean, I love Italians. I don't mean to be racist against Italians. I'm just saying that's an excellent little, a bit of realism.
Yeah. It's true. He knew. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the length of the scene, because I think it's very hard to do a long scene and still have it be interesting, to keep the tension going. And somehow
they play some classical music in the background while he's doing it, as though this is just like some heavenly heroic thing. And it is. It's wonderful. It's such a good little scene.
Yeah.
It's one of the best.
Yeah.
It's one of the best. So he was good, at first. He was good. And even, what's that one he did with Rodriguez with the vampires? That was good too. Dusk Till Dawn. You ever see that?
Yes. A lot of gore. Yeah.
Yeah. And just the premise of, like, you think you're watching a gangster movie for the first half and all of a sudden vampires. I mean, that was great. Yeah. I love that kind of twist, right?
Yeah.
It's original. It was good.
Well, he sort of remixed a whole bunch of ideas, and he was really good at. I think he grew out of his influences, and then he kind of needed to make another leap and just couldn't do it. And I think that's pretty common. I mean, of course, I'm going to mention here the band designed to be a metaphor for millions of things, and that's Metallica. Started out ripping off their influences, grew into their own for just a little brief period of time, and then decided to start making basically country music in a heavy metal style for a mainstream audience. But,
that's funny.
I know that's brutal, but it's true.
It's true.
Yeah. And they have a genius for it. I mean, I can't believe they're still selling albums, but
they're also riding on the coattails of Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. I mean, what do they? Really, come on. They've done nothing but shit since.
But it's shit that people like listening to. I mean, like the Black Album.
Success in that terms. Yeah, you see, this is a good example. Talking about normals, I knew it was over for them when I was in my hometown in Canada, and the hockey team was singing along to Enter Sandman and pumping their fists in the air. And I was like, "Oh, this is shit. This is now I know that this is trash."
Yeah, Yeah. I know it's true, but I mean, you look at these guys who just really know how to write a tune, and some of them do it for like 50 years. I mean, like AC/DC, right? I might not like all of it, but it's pretty hard to admit to deny that it's catchy. It's got good melodies.
I love AC/DC, yeah. But that's something else. That's like a band that had a specific. They never didn't stay true to themselves. I say, where Metallica really lost a lot of energy and lost the whole thing that everybody liked about them utterly. And changed and willfully changed themselves, and we're experimental now. What was that album where they came out and they're all like gay with the mascara and shit?
Which one?
One of those. One of them. There's one of them where like Lars and Kirk are like wearing mascara. They got short hair all of a sudden. They're wearing mascara, trying to look like Nirvana or something. I don't know. It was
Is that Load? I don't know.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. I don't even know these albums. I would, after Enter Sandman, after that album, Black Album, I was done. I was like, okay, it's over.
Yeah. But I mean, they know what normies like, and they're somehow able to crank it out. And part of it, I think, is their work process. I think they got really good Q&A, and I think they've got a really good idea of what the audience wants. But some people just have that, I mean, how do we explain Taylor Swift? She's written the same album 38 times. She's now like 45, and she's, pretending to be 17.
Is she that old now? Is she now an old, is she aging now? We're so old. We go through these. I didn't even think of that. Is she getting old now? Is that like a has-been thing already? Jesus Christ.
She's like in her 30s or something, but she acts like she's middle-aged. She's kind of, I don't know too much about the Taylor Swift other than that I'm fascinated by how much money the woman has made and how carefully she has managed her image. because she's basically cranked out the same album time and time again, and people still are buying the shit. So I mean, she's doing something right, you know.
Well, people, women, I don't know. Has a man ever bought any album of hers? Like,
Yeah, other than Redditors, no. Yeah.
Other than Redditors, yeah. Reddit's another place. Reddit, I believe, is another place you got kicked off. You told me. Reddit has been kicked off every social media app that you've ever heard of.
And most of the forums, it feels like.
Okay, them too. And even just for saying stuff like you're talking about now, like metal and Platonism, and it's just too evil.
Generally, you won't get kicked off until you reveal any kind of hard realist opinion. If you start talking about genetics, natural selection, God help us race, they will boot you. I think we have to pay attention to social class differences, genetically included, and racial differences, obviously, and ethnic differences. And I think when people are in normie mode, all they see is, I'm not going to be popular. And so they'll ban you. I think on big social media, at some point, the advertisers came in and said, we really don't want our ads on some page that's, talking about the fact that Italians are 8% African or something, Southern Italians. And I think that was part of what was driving it. Obviously, as we've seen in the evidence that's come out since, government subsidies and control had a huge part. There's always a capture, you call it capture, like regulatory capture, between law enforcement and anybody who holds the data, because law enforcement can seize their hard drives, can seize their equipment. So you want to make nice with law enforcement. And after a while, you start just doing whatever they say, and then you sort of figure out what they want and do it in advance so it doesn't get expensive for you. So I think there's a very nasty cycle on social media. But yeah, I got banned from a ton of forums because I just was honest about things that had been observed. You say, well, I think that ethnic groups are sizably different. Obviously, races are, and everybody's on a bell curve somewhere with an IQ, and that means that maybe 2% of your civilization has a chance of thinking its way out of a wet paper bag on a good day, and the rest are going to exist in a perpetual state of being befuddled. And I think when you say stuff like that on a forum, the ban hammer comes down pretty quickly. And of course, social media, Reddit was the worst because they hired ex-CIA people, I think, and NGO people. And they just went on a banning spree for anybody who wasn't a raving leftist. But Facebook, it took a while. They got enough complaints in and finally banned me there. And, on old Twitter, I got banned pretty quickly too. More recently, Musk had banned me as well because I was associated with a certain occult organization that apparently he doesn't want to be associated with at all. Is everyone always talks about equality, but the best kind of equality you would have is if everybody is able to compete on the same level, meaning they have roughly similar intellectual abilities, physical abilities, and health and stuff like that. And then you don't have anyone who's so useless they end up in extreme poverty or whatever. I always tell people, it's like, well, look at Finland. I mean, there's not this huge, in America, we have this huge widespread and average IQs. In Finland, it's tighter. I'm sure they have idiots like anyone else. I mean, idiots are universal, right? But I think that when everyone is sort of capable at a similar level, you don't have these, this crazy society where some people are earning $3 billion a year and other people are earning $20,000 a year and living in a trash can. I mean, it's just, so that's how I would phrase it to people. But
what's funny about the Finns? What's funny about the Finns that I didn't know? Maybe forgive if you know this, then forgive me. But I was talking to that guy once on another stream, Ed Dutton. You know that guy?
Yeah, I know.
He's more sort of an HBD person, and he's actually in Finland, married to a Finn. His children are half Finnish, but he was telling me all about them. I wasn't aware of this. That they're actually like the Finns are a naturally like. I forget what stage, but a very ancient people that were like amongst like the last surviving example of a type of people. Sort of, I don't know if they were sort of even Neolithic or something, like before the Aryan invasion. Like
yes.
So you maybe know this, right? So they're like a very unique, and I know they're sort of typically white people, etc. But they're an example of an ancient race, and they had certain qualities that he was telling me about. That he had, in his little scientific sort of autistic way, made note of, and I was like, oh, right. And some of them, it was funny because it was like very, very like hyper. conformist in their
Yeah.
society, and I can't remember now what he was saying, but it was funny. It was just funny to think that he had married into this ancient, you know,
Yeah.
tribe from so long ago that,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know.
you can tell from their language, the Finno-Ugric people are a very distinctive strain. Of course, your modern Finn is mostly Swedish at this point,
Oh,
but
is that
they've
it?
still got
Okay.
that ancient. It's very similar to the Sami people, uh, possibly ranged around from Siberia all the way over to Western Europe, and it's definitely an ancient tribe, and they've got a very clear culture that's hardwired into them, and I think that definitely helps. But it also seems that in Finland, there's just much less of a split. Like in America, you run into people every day who you're like, I can see why this person's impoverished. They can't do much, and I don't think you have as much of that in Finland. I think everyone's minimally competent on some level.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. There. John Gora says, I had to spend the better part of an hour this afternoon cleaning up a half putrefied mouse in a trap in the attic. Could have been worse. I think he's just saying that in reference to the what we're talking. This is an old comment about the universe and that. Is that what it's about, John Gores? You're saying, because I mean, like at no point when I say like the universe is overall good, then I'm sure you would agree.
Yes.
It's not. It doesn't mean that it's devoid of dreariness and misery and even torture, or long dark periods, and you just kind
Well,
of. Oh, what would you say? What would you say in response to that?
in order to sustain good, you're going to need some bad. You need the contrast to keep the cycle going. And so there's horror in life. I mean, I think this is what I like in Lovecraft is that he connects just how life can be utterly horrible. I mean, he metaphorizes it as these giant beasties that come out of the dark and eat everybody. But I mean, anyone who's had a friend die, who's seen a serious injury or illness, we're aware of how awful life can be, and even how everyday shit. I mean, everyone's had a day where like the doorknob breaks off in your hand, the toilet flush lever breaks off in your hand, your car won't start. Everything is just fucked up. All the little details. There's definitely patterns to this universe where some days you're doomed. And I think there's definite darkness in it. But without that darkness, it couldn't keep itself, it couldn't have enough internal tension to keep moving forward through time. And so that's necessary. And, I mean, I think ultimately all of us have to deal with death. We're all going to die. We don't really like that idea, but it's going to happen one way or another. And so you say, well, how can this be a good universe when we die and when little mice die and rot and you have to clean up the mess? And the thing is that you can't really, this is Plato's contribution, his ceremony of opposites. You can't really have something just existing in a static state, or it becomes oppressive in itself. If all we had was good, we'd start to hate it. So you need these opposites. Good comes out of bad, and bad comes out of good. And therefore, there's always going to be good, just not every goddamn minute of every day. And at some point, you have to die, and you basically take a little nap and wake up somewhere else and do something else. And that's I think going back to your point, I mean, the fact that we're here at all, that we can reason, that we can have these experiences, that we can experience great joy, that we can have love even, assuming that's not an illusion. I mean, I think that this is a good universe and it tends toward good, but in the process of that, it's going to need some bad. And it's like, imagine it from a literary perspective. I mean, if a book was just about how somebody had nothing but good days and every meal was great and there were donuts everywhere, I mean, it would be a boring book. You need adventure, you need the darkness to pull the light along. And so there's kind of that balance. And I think that, you know, death metal brought people face to face with disease, death, mutilation, being maimed, horrible things, serial killers, all that good stuff. And part of the reason is just for us to kind of get over the fact that we're off put by that so much that we forget that life is basically good. I mean, metal music is about the worship of power. It's about understanding the power to make choices, the power to understand things in this world, how beautiful that is, and how strong it makes all of us. And so instead of fearing, oh no, the power might be used against me, we have to embrace the fact that this gives our lives meaning and actually makes us happy that we have things to overcome. I realize that's Nietzschean language and I put it into Plato, but hopefully you know what I mean. And so, yeah, every few months I have to go take a dead creature out of somewhere and come face to face with the gnats and the stench. And it's truly horrible, but it's a good reminder that, that dead creature, when I pitch it in the woods, there's going to be a plant there next year, and it's going to be really healthy. So from death comes life. And this also, I'm sure you're well aware, is one of the esoteric principles that every opposite produces its opposite, and therefore the whole thing stays together.
Yeah, what was formerly a great and good thing, it will not last forever, and it will become the compost heap from which the seeds of the next good thing will eventually come. But even that will not, only in some ways, resemble the former thing. Will not ever be the same.
Yeah.
Ty Rogerson says, exactly. There is no condition by which the universe is not awesome. Yeah, that's a great attitude.
Good idea.
Great metal attitude there.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing we like to see. But we kind of got off course there.
Sure.
Talking about life in the universe. I originally wanted to. Just because I asked you about what your opinion on the occult, that whole thing was a tangent from that, because that was only one part of a series of questions I was going to ask you about. About what? Something about the alt-right. I can't remember now.
I am the master of tangents.
So far back. So far back. Shit. But yeah, I mean, there you go. I mean, there's some good. I'm so glad that you agreed, because I talked to a lot of people. I had a lot of oppositional friction from people. You mentioned Plato and Nietzsche there.
Yeah.
And there's some people that are like strict Nietzscheans and really take very seriously his criticism of Plato. And I love Nietzsche. I assume you do as well. I think he was a great philosopher.
Oh, yeah.
But I always take that aspect of him as kind of like, a bit sensational. He was making his mark, saying, I'm against Plato for this and that reason. And, I honestly don't think he took it as seriously as some of these other people do. And there's even people whose opinion I respect, and pagans and things, that are very much against Plato and Platonism. Ooh. And see it as, and they have this, I believe their attitude is that there was formerly a stricter sort of patriarchy in place, a strict religious patriarchy in place, and that Socrates was the origin, and Plato were the origin of a kind of hippie revolution of, and the entirety of philosophy is kind of a reaction against, or something like this. This is the idea I get from these people, which I cannot accept, because there's so much incredibly, everything of value is in the philosophy, and particularly in Plato, that I cannot accept this notion, even though I'm a great fan of patriarchy. And
they're not wrong, but here's the thing: everything is cyclic. So as much as I'm a fan of eternal things, like, for example, the aristocracy, there needs to be a constant internal dialogue that reaffirms things. We're talking about the occult, right? One of the things that's great about it is that it is esoteric. And it also, like paganism, tends not to write down a lot of things. And you ask, well, why the hell would you do that? Wouldn't you write it down so you could sell a book, make $1 million? No, the answer is that every generation has to reinvent itself. Every generation has to rediscover these truths. And if they don't do that, what you do is set up symbols, and then people just exploit those, kind of like shitty metal bands, just like, oh yeah, we're going to do the black metal thing too. And you're like, well, there's no profundity to this, and it's not even really all that interesting, but they're able to rip it off because there it is, it's tangible. So esoteric thought works around this, because you basically never make these strong statements. You say, well, your path begins here. Good luck, pilgrim. And in every generation, some are going to figure it out, and that keeps it alive. And in the same way, I say, a patriarchy, you're going to need to understand why you're doing things. If you don't understand why you're doing things, the tradition is dead, and it has been replaced with conformity. In the same way, we might say that, the whole Christian God thing, where he says, well, believe in me and you'll go to heaven. It's like, well, then people aren't believing in you because they believe in you. They're believing in you because you bribed them with eternal life. And that's a problem. And so, what Plato was doing was rebelling against a declining society. Its traditions had become rotten. It was time for the Nietzschean reevaluation of values, and you were going to rediscover ultimately what your ancestors did, but you were going to remove the incrustation of methods and of precedents and of little quirks that got sort of wrapped in by history and get back to the core of why they were doing those things. Because unless you understand the why, you're not actually doing something because you are associated toward a positive goal. You're doing it because you want to participate in something. And I think that Nietzsche was the same way. He said, whatever beliefs we have here have been eroded by time and no longer have meaning. And I would say that for anyone who wants to study Nietzsche, you should look at the God is dead statement. God is dead and we have killed him. How did we kill him? We no longer believed in him the right way. So reading Nietzsche as an atheist, I think, should be controversial. I think he has said things about the death of God, but he is talking about the specific symbol of God. He is not saying there is no God. He's just saying this image of God you have does not exist. And in fact, it does not exist because you can't believe in it. As he said, when you have the apparent world and the symbolic world, and the symbolic world exists in order to have influence in the apparent world, and it then discards the apparent world in favor of pure symbolism, well, then you no longer need the symbolism because the apparent world is totally divorced from it. And I think that Plato was pointing out something similar about Athens. He was saying, once he tells the story of the gold and silver races, right? The people who originally inhabited Greece, and they did things because they were the right thing to do, and they expected no reward. They were gold and silver in their spirit, not necessarily in their wealth. Well, over time, discord arose. Boy, there's a lot packed into that phrase, I'll tell you. Discord arose, and people started doing things simply to get ahead and to manipulate each other. And eventually they reached a libertarian compromise where money was the way that they controlled the bad and tried to aim toward the good and yada, yada, yada. And I think his point was, he was both a reformer and he was completely in line with the oldest of traditions, but he removed all that crust. His point was, we don't need all of these weird little superstitions and rituals. What we need to do is understand what we're trying to do here, and we've lost sight of that. And Nietzsche basically said the same thing. So, I get why people would say, these guys have rejected the patriarchy, it's bad, but I don't think they rejected the patriarchy at all. I think Plato, in fact, gives you a lot of reasons to think about why a patriarchy, or at least complementary gender roles, make a lot of sense. But his point was, when your civilization's in decline, you can't just apply methods from the past to try to fix it. You have to get yourself oriented back toward the right goals. You have to get your spirit right. This is ironically the same thing that Jesus was saying. He went into, Jesus is basically a ripoff of Socrates, right? We all pretty much accept that. He went into a Pharisaic time where people were more interested in following rules than they were in trying to get to what those rules were designed to protect and to develop. And he said, you guys are going through the motions, but you haven't oriented your inner selves, your souls, your spirits toward what you actually want. And this is the doctrine called sola fide, which means by faith alone. And it's very similar to Buddhism in that it's saying, you have to figure out, you have to make choices, figure out what is good as opposed to what is bad. And you have to orient yourself positively toward the good instead of simply trying to get rid of the bad and making lots of rules to force everybody to behave as if they were good. And that's why Socrates is fascinating, because he was rediscovering ancient truths, but he was doing it in the face of a rotting empire. The civilization was already in decay, and he was rejecting the decay.
Yeah, I didn't mean when I said patriarchy, I didn't mean like in any kind of modern context that to suggest Plato was some kind of endorser of feminism or anything like that. I was thinking of the paterfamilias system, which was a bit more entrenched maybe before that, but it was still, that went on well into Rome and so forth. So it wasn't like he was the rejecter of that precisely. And in fact, like, it's just a logical premise, the basis of all philosophy. Like the opening of the Republic is, I believe, Socrates is, someone presents to him what is, he says, we cannot know what beauty is. You think you know what, you all think you know what beauty is. You don't know. You have no clue. And he basically just presents an argument where someone says, well, how can you say this to us? And he says, well, I think this is beautiful. You think that is beautiful? What is beauty? You tell me, like, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sort of displays many extremely logical observances of the world, which is the basis of anything good that ever happened
Yeah.
in what we call civilization, right? So
Yes.
I believe their argument is something to do. This is why I think I totally reject, absolutely reject everybody who tries to reject Plato in this sense. And I don't understand their arguments, but it's to do with some guy's book. Some Victorian guy wrote a book along with Nietzsche, but he took Nietzsche even more seriously and expanded on it. I think I can't remember the details of this. I heard it all once before, like a long time ago. But they sort of think that Plato was some kind of hippie that kind of rejected the original culture and was the original liberal fucking revolution or something.
Well, I would say he's in the same boat as a lot of us. We're culturally liberal. We believe in the human experiment. We believe that we need to be open to ideas. We believe that we need to know why we're doing things. But in that pursuit, through that pursuit, he finds himself back to a truly Neolithic conservatism. He's what people today would consider him a religious fanatic. People would also consider him an extreme fascist, in that he basically said, there's good people and there's dysfunctional people, and you need to lose the dysfunctional ones and keep the good ones. He was not, Plato is more in line with the final chapters of the Odyssey than he is with any kind of hippie shit. He's got blood.
There's no way he's a rejection of those things. And whatever Nietzsche was up to, Nietzsche was also a brilliant genius. I always just think he used that as a kind of sensational platform to launch his other stuff. And there's no way that he would agree with a lot of these people. That I've heard people say that Platonism is like Satanism, and it's like, they think it's evil, and I just like, it drives me nuts.
Well,
let me see. Oh, go on. What do you
Platonism is close to Luciferianism. In a certain sense, but Luciferianism is really nothing more than standard occultism and paganism. I mean, it's a recognition of, I see Lucifer and Satan as Promethean figures. And I think it's a recognition that basically you can't have good without bad. You can't have beauty without pain. And that's, it's very metal. It's a useful thing to realize. I think that there's a whole lot of kiddie Satanists out there, and they tend to basically reinvent the Democrat Party platform with a little more Satan in it. But it's not serious. I mean, it's a social thing. It's not a, philosophical thing in itself. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people hate Plato because I think they misunderstand what he was going on about, which was really, how do we understand cause-effect relationships such that we understand how opposites produce each other and how that implies a larger order than what we're seeing. I mean, the core of Platonism is metaphysics. And once you understand that, I think it's a very useful way to understand any religion. It's a very good thing to have.
And Plotinus, I must say, Plotinus was the one that really, I felt, changed my life. Did you read Plotinus?
Yeah, read Phaedo. Everyone started with the Republic, but I think they should read Phaedo. But any Plato you read is going to lead you back to roughly the same places.
I spoke with Nicholas Schreck a couple of months ago talking about Satanists. That was pretty funny. But he would more or less, if he was here now, he would totally agree with everything you're saying. I think, I'm pretty sure. He was more or less, in the end, a kind of traditional pagan kind of guy. Is what I gleaned out of him for all the former Satan, all the Anton LaVey Satanism that he was formerly involved in. Sure. It was all he calls himself Buddhist now, but he was more or less
very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he was more or less just like us. It was the same shit. So yeah. I don't know. That was good. Arlik L. Moorsang says, if a religious doctrine believes humans are slave chattel put on this earth to serve you, why wouldn't you want to genomically, memetically breed the docile slave chattel? It naturally follows. Well,
does he name the religion?
Well, no, but if a religious doctrine, okay, so why wouldn't we want to breed more slaves? Well, I mean, there's enough of them, isn't there? We need. We don't have any control of the people who control the slaves now are the people. This is what I'm saying. Are making these little ads and media slogans and things. I want to understand what you have to say to them to control them, because all you have to do is say certain words, and that's boom. I
I
don't know
think
what it is.
I think it's patterns. I mean, you have to understand what motivates them, which is it's compassion to understand what motivates them. I mean, you're looking at animal creatures that have certain needs, and they're trying to fill those needs. Some of those needs are psychological. Like, let's break it down really far and use a shitty movie. So, why did everyone love E.T., the movie? Okay, Steven Spielberg, he's a genius for making movies that normies love. I can't stand them. They've got weird music coming in at random times, you know, very sentimental, very overblown. But everybody loved E.T. Why? Okay, what's the core of that movie? Most people would say it's the alien. I say no, it's the divorced family. Look at when the movie came out. Divorce was absolutely raping America's ass at that point. Kids were extremely alienated, and we have a single mother who's divorced with a couple kids, and the kids are so friggin' lonely
Yeah,
because of this that
yeah,
basically it's what everyone wants. We all want ET as a friend when our parents are so crazy we just want to run out in the backyard and hide. And I
yeah.
think that he tapped into a psychological need. You know, same way, what does Metallica tap into these days? It doesn't tap in for me, but starting with the Black Album, they've tapped into the need for people to have some emotional connection to something that's bold. They want, um, nothing else matters. You know, you have a song like that. It's a very sentimental song. It's a very romantic song, but at the same time, he's in there just doing tough guy shit too, right? So that lets people sort of feel like, yeah, I haven't sold myself out, but I can still have an emotional connection to something. And I think that's how you make a superior product, because what we are talking about, you and I here, is products. How is it that some people design products that everybody loves? I mean, like that Dyson guy, right? With the vacuum cleaner and the fan that looks like a dildo and all that stuff.
Yeah, but it's only because in the system of consumerism, they've tapped into what they have been studying for a long time and know what will motivate them. But like we don't want to motivate them from a consumerist angle. We want to motivate them politically,
To
or just to
politically.
get them to do what we want
Yeah.
in general, right? And so
I
it wouldn't
mean,
be.
I
Yeah,
think what you want with people like that is just to get them to follow something and support it. I think beyond that, it's really beyond. It's not something they can handle. I think of this. There was a little bit of a kerfuffle over this. Michel Houellebecq, the French writer, at some point he offended the French because he said, "I like Americans. I like their big refrigerators. I like their big-titted women. Everybody would want these things." And I think that's the truth of consumerism. I mean, the products that succeed is something where you go, oh, yeah, that could kind of be useful. I do want a bigger fridge. I kind of would like, my wife to have bigger tits or whatever. People it's universal. And that's a handy phrase for lowest common denominator, but it also refers to things that appeal to all of us because they address some part of our lives. So I think there's
well,
a genius to product design.
that's funny. That's a funny example, and it throws me for a tailspin in my little personal psychology, because what I know of the French is that their overall lifestyle is so superior in every, and especially in a kind of like sensational, sensualist sense
Sure.
to anything American, but only through a totally different viewpoint where you can say the fridge and the big tits, but by making that your criteria or even trying to frame it in that way, it's a horrible mistake. Where they're out with their like dogs digging up truffles under oak trees and just drinking the most amazing wine and eating the best cheese and having like totally decadent sex, you know, in their own way, in a superior kind of I don't know, more ancient way or something, I don't know.
Well, I
Yeah.
think what he wanted to say is there's a reason
I,
certain
I know,
things.
I understand. I know what he was trying to say. I just mean like it's the whole concept of that just threw me for a tailspin. I know what he was trying to say. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
agree in a sense, but just that like that whole idea, like it's problematic for me. And some it just reminded me of that whole because this was my experience when I moved to Europe and then um, came to understand European things more, having grown up in a small town in Canada, which is like Canadians are like second-rate Americans, really, right? Because
No
this culture's
comment.
been so well, the culture's been so diluted, and just like it never was. It was so influenced by America. Let's say,
Yeah.
it's you can barely tell the difference. I could meet a Canadian or American here, and I won't immediately know if they're one or the other unless they tell me.
Wow.
You know, so um, what was my point there? I've lost it.
Canada was doomed by the fact that it's just in the shadow of this much larger economy. And I think
Yeah.
what we're talking about here with the big tits and the fridges is in part which is more important, consumerism or culture. Obviously, I come down on the side of culture, like I think you do. At the same time, I think we find ourselves in a world where we are competing with products. And so it's good to know how this stuff works and why it appeals. Um, I mean, do we distill cultures down to their fridges? No. And do we want to change the French? No. Does buying a larger fridge change the French? Maybe. It could be they don't go out to the shop and buy fresh stuff as much. That could be a problem, right? I can see
Oh,
where you're
that
coming
that
from with
it
that.
absolutely does. The markets in France and Italy, you've never seen anything like it. The fresh food markets. It's so oppositional to anything American. It's in the street. You just like go out in the street. And every street has a local market where farmers come in with their produce. Absolutely natural, organic, just the best, absolute quality. It's got nothing to do with the middleman profiteering consumerist kind of American way at all. And it doesn't matter. It happens every weekend. There's no need for a giant fridge because you just go to the market and you enjoy yourself going to the market. It's part of the culture to go to the market. It's just the whole viewpoint is totally different. You know?
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting because of all the parts in America, I would say Texas has the strongest culture. The South, definitely. The North is a void.
Yeah,
Um,
probably. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, fucking Yankees. But it's interesting because culture can adapt to things. And I think that oftentimes what we think of as the culture is the surface. When I think of French culture, I think of the determination to make every part of life pleasurable. I think that, and Welbeck writes about this. He says, life is meant to be pleasurable. That doesn't mean all of it's going to be pleasurable. There's going to be downsides and bad days and all that. But his point was, in the whole, you should be surrounded by beautiful things. You should be having a beautiful experience. You should be connecting to the world around you because you're surrounded by beautiful nature and people who are decent. And I think that's what you're tapping into there is like, yeah, if you live in a nice French village and you know all the people that you're buying from and you go down to the market, you're going to get beautiful food. You're going to have a lovely experience and you don't mind doing it on a regular basis. So you can have a smaller fridge. Now he lived in Paris, so I think it was a different experience. So I don't know how that all calculates out, but I can see the clash. But I think in general, the point would be this: culture is upstream of economics in the sense that it influences how people buy certain products and why they buy them. For example, everyone makes fun of us for our big pickup trucks in Texas, but when you're out there in the wild and you're covering long distances and you're hauling stuff, you kind of need a big ass pickup truck. And so I think there's sort of culture is more of a mental state than practices per se. And this gets back to your analysis, of Plato versus the way things have been done. I don't want to say tradition, but convention. At some point, convention can overshadow culture, and culture itself is, I think of like the palace at Versailles, right? Somebody went through that and decided that they were going to make every fixture in that place beautiful and make them all correspond to each other. When I was there, I don't think I've ever seen a place where all of the parts were in harmony with each other as much as that. It's truly a religious experience. You walk into that place and you're like, of course, it's like listening to Mozart. You're like, oh, life makes perfect sense now. It's all logical. And I think that's what I take out of the French. Maybe it's related to the markets. Definitely their attitude toward wine is not found anywhere else. They're perfectionists.
I mean, if you go anywhere in France or Italy, and I mean anywhere, and you order a wine or a coffee, you'll be just, this is the best fucking thing I've ever had in my life. I remember being in a train station. I remember being rushed in a train station and being in some shitty little alcove with some like rough looking rednecky Italian woman. And she took the time to make a proper espresso thing. And like, it was glorious, where it's like it's the focus of their culture is to have quality in these things, it's just totally different. There's a couple questions here. I've kept you for a very long time already. So let me just try and get a couple here. This Bob guy has another question. 2 questions I want to ask you. Can you ask Brett how it was being part of the alt-right? What happened to make it fall?
Oof. That's a good one. What made the alt-right fall was really 2 things. One, internally, it lost focus and sort of fell apart because everyone was trying to find the right way to survive the censorship and the forces against us. And 2, of course, it got assimilated. It got completely assimilated. Everything we were talking about got picked up by mainstream conservatives. In fact, a lot of what we were talking about simply echoed what guys like the Know Nothings and the John Birch Society were talking about in the previous generation. So we can't even claim it's all us. Our approach to it was different, was unique. But I think the ideas we were hitting on are eternal and also had been there present before. But they were assimilated. The Tea Party picked up some of them, then MAGA picked up the rest. And at that point, we were becoming irrelevant. But there was also a lot of internal division. Nobody really knew how to respond to getting called Nazis, getting censored, getting deplatformed. A lot of people got taken out back then, had their lives literally destroyed in the sense of everything that they used to live on a daily basis was taken from them. So the lifestyle they had, the daily routine they had, it was all gone. They woke up and found themselves living on a couch in somebody's garage with $128 in their wallet and no future prospects. And that happened all over the place. Some people went to jail. This happens routinely in political upset. And I think nobody really knew how to respond to that. One group wanted to dress up in Nazi uniforms and go scream Sieg Heil at these people until we could finally get a hot war. Another group wanted to be more cerebral and see if we could find common ground. Still others wanted to try to become libertarians or become liberals or something like that. And I think that divided what had formerly been a group, because formerly the group, we were just aiming toward what we wanted and we weren't obsessed by methods. But as soon as we were hitting serious opposition, people started thinking in terms of methods as opposed to goals, and we didn't have as much commonality there. So I think that's what fried it on that level. But I think really what was wrecking it from within was that we were getting assimilated. All of our ideas were slowly getting picked up by others, and it became important not to state them in completely alienating ways. And when that happened, I think there was a further internal division where people were sort of trying to purge the most critical and the most un-PC among us. So basically things fell apart, but luckily we had already delivered our payload.
Delivered our payload, yeah. We spunked in that slut. we delivered the seed, and she was pregnant. So maybe mission accomplished, right? Like a praying mantis, we got devoured. We got devoured in the process, but
sometimes your head gets eaten. What can you say?
What can you do? What can you do? Bob also says another interesting question. I must say, I think most people would be interested in the stream if you related these topics to Bret Stephens and why he is famous for many people watching this now. So I thought I did. I mean, I tried to.
You did great. Yeah.
What? What else can we say? He was very influential, and he vanished off my personal radar for many years. And in fact, in the meantime, I had even told you fuck off and blocked you without even knowing it was you on the X for no good reason. I don't know why that fucking happened. No one asked me that. Yeah. But you know, he's
Yeah, I don't
got
take
he's a
social
controversial
media.
man, and it's not easy for him to maintain his profile on the on the social media. But maybe it's time for you to come back, because there's, like I said, yeah, you should go on the Telegram. You can
All
say
right,
whatever you want on there, pretty much. Yeah, yeah.
that is pretty nice.
You should-
I think I was very lucky to come into the internet when it was new, and set up some opinions and stake out some areas that other people weren't really interested in. But I think there was a small group of people who really were interested in that stuff, and we were able to at least achieve some coherence where a lot of the other stuff really wasn't very coherent. I think about the white nationalist days and how there was a lot of ranting and there was a lot of just very angry stuff that didn't really have a direction. And so we gave people an alternative to that. At the anus, we explained how nationalism, Darwinism, that kind of thing, were logical and led to a better existence, a better quality of life, a better internal happiness. Basically, finding reasons why some of the stuff in the past was logical and why we probably shouldn't have discarded it. And I think that sort of flowered onward into Corrupt and another site, and eventually into America. And we've got an audience of people who like reading about this stuff and are interested in what the future will hold. A lot of it's timing, and I think a lot of it's just being willing to doggedly stick to things that everyone else prefers to ignore. I mean, to walk the path I have is to be alone, and it's fine because that's necessary. But someone needs to talk about these things, and other people then carry those ideas on in different directions. And it's better to have an open discussion about things and an honest discussion, and to talk about whether we're realists or symbolists and stuff like that, and get people thinking about these things. Because I think oftentimes groups of people, among them there are very talented people, and they will make something of this. Nothing is done by one man alone. But I think I've been very fortunate to be able to write about these things. It's been a great joy. And I continue doing it because I enjoy it and because I enjoy having some influence. And I see echoes of what I do mentioned to me by people, just, oh yeah, that really was helpful to me when I was doing this. And they've gone on to take the ideas in different directions and to have fame and success of their own. And that always makes me happy. But I think if the current political system needs a Satan, but that Satan doesn't want to be dramatic and instead prefers to be nerdly and logical, that's me.
Yeah, and that's a good summary of the Brett Stevens experience right there. And so for all these like nerds you're following on social media that you think their ideas are so radical and original, like probably they got something from, like, they don't even know that what they borrowed from you or it's stolen in their little niche groups and their, like, whatever bullshit they're doing. So yeah, there you go. There's the Brett Stevens. I think we'll put an end to it there, right? And yeah, so you're doing the American still. I remember it had such an influence on me when I was first getting into all this shit, the America, along with those other websites we were talking about. So I'm so glad you're still doing it. And like I said, most people still know you, I think, from when I said I was going to talk to you, from the death metal one.
Sure.
What's it called?
Deathmetal.org. Yeah.
Deathmetal.org. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's like, even I'm sure people of all different types are following that one.
Who doesn't love death metal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's also a funny niche thing that, it's very enjoyable when you get into that world, but it takes a certain type of person for sure.
Yeah. I love death metal. I think it's the perfect music for certain states of mind, and I can see it having ritual uses as well. But I think that it's a gateway for many of us to think about the world outside of normiedom. So yeah, very, very proud to be associated with deathmetal.org.
Yeah, it's a good way to filter out the normals for sure. Death metal. So, I mean, there you go. I think that's it. We'll leave it there. And that was the Brett Stevens. Thank you, Brett. That was a excellent, interesting, incredibly in-depth conversation about life, the universe, and everything else.
Thank you for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and there you go. Thanks a lot.
All right.
I'll end it there, and I think that's it. Goodbye.
Good night.
Good night.